I sat there, sipping cheap red wine in a dress I'd borrowed from a friend. The restaurant was one of those modern bistros in the heart of the city, where the menus didn't have prices, and laughter was used more to compete than to connect. Across the table sat my ex-husband, his new girlfriend, and a group of old college friends who had once been mine, but somewhere along the years had shifted loyalties to him. They were all talking about vacations I hadn't been on, cars I hadn't driven, and investments I hadn't made. Somewhere between the truffle pasta and passive-aggressive anecdotes, someone joked, "You remember when Rachel couldn't even afford lunch in college? Girl, I'm still surprised you walked in here. Isn't this place a bit above your range?" The table laughed. Even he laughed. I didn't. He hadn't changed. The man who once told me I was too emotional, too soft, too boring to understand ambition, was now dating a woman who laughed too hard at cruel jokes and clung to his arm like it meant something. I was once her. What no one at that table knew was that 2 years ago, when he left me for an emotionally fulfilling connection with his secretary, I had signed away more than my marriage. I walked away from our house, our joint assets, and the startup we built together. All for my peace, but what he didn't know was, I didn't leave empty-handed. I left with the loyalty of our silent partner, the angel investor he never bothered to meet. I took my shares quietly, built what was left of the business into something bigger, and used my half to invest in a string of restaurants, including the one we were now sitting in. I looked around the table, not saying a word. That night wasn't about proving anything. But life has a way of writing the perfect script. As dessert was being served, the waiter approached our table and said, "Apologies for the delay, Ms. Rachel. The manager asked me to let you know the owner's table is ready. Would you like to move there now or finish your meal here?" Silence. He looked stunned. His girlfriend blinked rapidly. One of the friends muttered, "Wait. What?" I stood up slowly, smiled softly, and said, "Tell him I'll be there in a minute. I was just enjoying the company of some old acquaintances." I left the table with no need to look back. The air behind me was thick with confusion, discomfort, and maybe, just maybe, regret. As I sat at the owner's table, glass of champagne in hand, I thought about how betrayal doesn't end us. It teaches us. That emotional infidelity, the kind where someone pours their soul into another while you sit dry and unseen, doesn't have to break you. Sometimes it wakes you up. And when it does, you don't come back for revenge. In relationships where emotional connection is imbalanced, it becomes easy to lose yourself while trying to hold everything else together. I remember the early days with him, how his eyes used to light up when I entered a room, how he would ask questions and actually listen, how he'd hold my hand like I was his anchor. That all faded so quietly, I didn't even realize it until I was already starving for something as basic as being heard. We were building something together, our home, our future, a company from scratch, and somewhere in that process, I became invisible. I was there for the long nights and the failed launches, the self-doubt, the strategy meetings, the endless nights we stayed up calculating risk. Yet as the money began to trickle in, and he began to find his confidence, mine was chipped away. He didn't do it with cruelty, but with subtle dismissal, laughing off my ideas, forgetting to introduce me in meetings, brushing my hand away in public like affection, had become a weakness he no longer wanted to show. What hurts more than words is the absence of them. He stopped checking in, stopped asking how I felt. The meals we used to cook together became takeout containers left on opposite ends of the couch. I started feeling like a piece of furniture, functional, present, but replaceable. Emotional neglect doesn't look dramatic. It's the slow drip of silence where there once was attention. I would dress up just to see if he'd notice. I changed my perfume. I even signed up for a writing class just to feel something that belonged solely to me. But when you start seeking validation outside your relationship just to feel human again, it's not always about cheating. Sometimes, it's about surviving. The irony is, from the outside, I was the lucky one. People saw us as a power couple. They admired our ambition. But what they didn't know was that behind closed doors, I was reduced to a business partner who shared a bed with someone who had emotionally checked out long ago. He started confiding in others, his female assistant, a friend's wife, even his therapist, people who weren't me. I could feel his withdrawal, the way he'd light up while texting someone else, the guarded smile when I asked who he was talking to. That emotional intimacy, once reserved for me, had been quietly handed to someone else without so much as a conversation. The power dynamic shifted. Financially, he began to act like he carried more weight because technically, the company was under his name. That was our agreement during setup. My credit wasn't strong, and we agreed it was temporary. Temporary turned permanent, and with that paper advantage came a slow but steady erasure of my efforts. Meetings were booked without consulting me. Creative decisions were made while I was running errands. And at night, I'd lie awake next to a man who couldn't even sense the silence he'd created in me. It's not always loud, the death of a relationship. Sometimes, it's so quiet that you keep convincing yourself it's not happening. Until one day, you don't recognize yourself anymore. He started calling me too sensitive. The same way people describe a warning label they no longer want to deal with. You're taking things too personally. He'd say, when I voiced how lonely I felt, I've just been busy. But busy wasn't why he didn't notice when I cried in the shower. Busy wasn't why he stopped asking what I was passionate about. Busy was just a word that covered a multitude of emotional absences he never planned to correct. That's when I knew I was slowly disappearing, not from the world, but from the relationship. I had become the emotional caretaker in a space where no one was caring for me. And yet I stayed, because we had history, because I believed love was about pushing through the hard parts. But what no one tells you is that love, when it's only flowing one way, stops being love and becomes emotional labor. It becomes endurance, and while I was enduring, he was emotionally investing elsewhere. I started feeling like a stranger in my own life, a silent observer to a relationship that once felt like a home but now resembled an agreement, cold, practical, and devoid of warmth. That's where the story begins, not with anger, not with betrayal, but with the quiet realization that you are no longer needed. Not because you aren't worthy, but because someone else has already taken your place in a role you didn't know was up for replacement. It's strange how you can sleep next to someone every night and still feel completely abandoned. After months of quiet detachment, I started noticing things that weren't always visible at first glance. The way he smiled at his phone, the sudden secrecy with his screen, how he'd leave the room to take certain calls or answer late, night messages with a hushed voice and the lights off. At first, I didn't want to assume anything. I told myself not to become the paranoid woman who accuses without proof. But the silence between us had turned into a void, and something in me just knew. I was no longer the one he turned to when he needed comfort or connection. He had emotionally left the relationship, and worse, he had handed that intimacy to someone else. The part that hurts most is not just the loss of affection, but the slow erosion of trust. When your partner begins to bond deeply with someone else, sharing thoughts, laughter, frustrations, parts of themselves that once belonged to you, it cuts in a way physical cheating never could. I wasn't angry at first. I was just confused. I'd sit across from him at the dinner table and watch him zone out, sometimes mid-sentence, and I knew his mind wasn't with me. He'd be present in body, but emotionally anchored elsewhere, like someone had placed a tether around his heart and pulled it quietly in a different direction. He never admitted it, not once, but the signs were everywhere. I found myself comparing our conversations, brief, mechanical, obligatory, with the way his tone softened when he talked to her on the phone. "It's just work," he'd say, but no one talks to a colleague about their childhood dreams or their mother's cancer or their fear of failure for over an hour, behind closed doors. I tried confronting him gently once. I asked if he still felt connected to me, if he felt something missing. He sighed and said, "You're reading too much into things. You've always been like this." That statement, meant to shut me down, just confirmed what I feared. He had already emotionally exited, and now I was being cast as the problem for noticing. I began to feel like a placeholder, someone who occupied the logistics of a relationship, while the emotional intimacy I craved was outsourced to someone else. There's a specific kind of heartbreak in watching your partner invest in another person emotionally while you're sitting in the same house, washing their clothes, cooking their meals, and keeping the shell of a relationship intact. It's invisible to others. People still thought we looked good together, but behind that facade, I was unraveling, piece by piece, in the quiet corners of a home that no longer felt like mine. The hardest part wasn't the betrayal itself. It was the doubt it sowed inside me. I started questioning my worth. Was I not interesting enough anymore? Had I become dull, predictable? I remembered all the nights I stayed up thinking about what I could say or do to bring the spark back. I read articles, watched relationship videos, even scheduled a weekend getaway he canceled at the last minute. Nothing worked, because he wasn't lacking stimulation. He was just emotionally fed elsewhere. And I was slowly starving. I once caught a glimpse of a message on his screen, a simple one. "I'm proud of you. I believe in you." It wasn't romantic in the traditional sense, but it wrecked me. Because those were the exact words I used to whisper to him on nights he was afraid our startup would collapse. I realized then that he wasn't just confiding in her. He was transferring every emotional ritual we once had and building a mirror version of us with someone new. That's when I understood emotional infidelity is far more dangerous than physical betrayal, because it builds a bridge that only two people can walk across. And once you're on the outside of that bridge, you're not just alone, you're forgotten. I didn't tell anyone, not yet. I wasn't ready to explain to friends or family why I was quietly mourning a relationship that, from the outside, still looked functional. But every time I laid in bed, back turned away from him, and he didn't notice my silence, didn't ask if I was okay, I knew. Emotional intimacy had left the room. I was no longer the person he reached for, and as much as I tried to deny it, I had already become a stranger in the one place I used to feel safest. The affair hadn't touched his body, but it had consumed his soul. And in doing so, it had shattered mine. After weeks of carrying that invisible grief, I started to detach, not out of revenge, but as an act of self-preservation. There's a strange transformation that happens when you accept that you are no longer emotionally chosen. It's like grieving someone who is still alive, still brushing past you in the hallway, still drinking coffee across from you, but without the warmth or familiarity. I stopped begging for his attention. I stopped asking the questions I already knew the answers to. Instead, I turned inward, quietly rebuilding the parts of myself I had neglected for far too long. My therapist called it emotional recovery. I called it learning how to stop waiting for someone to see me. What people don't understand is that sometimes healing doesn't begin in solitude. It begins in confrontation, not the explosive kind, the quiet kind, the one that happens in social spaces where roles are put on display. That dinner wasn't supposed to be a turning point. It was meant to be a casual reunion, a simple gathering of old college friends, most of whom had slowly drifted into his orbit after the separation. He invited me as if we were still amicable, but I think deep down he wanted to parade the new version of his life in front of me, his new partner, his successful charm, his curated narrative of growth. I accepted the invitation out of curiosity, maybe even a need for closure. I remember standing in front of the mirror that night, hands trembling slightly as I applied lipstick. It had been a long time since I allowed myself to be seen, not just physically, but as a woman who still mattered. The restaurant was upscale, the kind of place we used to talk about owning back in our early days of brainstorming over greasy pizza and crumpled notebooks. The irony wasn't lost on me. The moment I walked in, I felt the shift, the subtle looks, the whispered "I didn't think she'd show," the performative surprise of his new girlfriend greeting me like we were old friends. The conversation at dinner felt like a minefield of backhanded compliments and loaded nostalgia. They brought up stories from college that had nothing to do with who we were now, but everything to do with how they wanted to frame me: small, broke, the girl who once borrowed money for textbooks and worked double shifts to get by. It was subtle, but cruel. One of them laughed and said, "Remember when Rachel used to live off canned soup? You've come a long way. This place must feel like a luxury." And he didn't defend me, he laughed with them. That's when I knew the emotional betrayal wasn't just between us anymore. It had spilled into how he allowed others to treat me. What none of them knew was that while he was investing in someone else emotionally, I was investing in myself quietly. I had taken the shares from our business, signed over in the divorce out of arrogance and underestimation on his part, and used them to partner with one of his old mentors who still respected me. Together, we opened several high-end restaurant ventures, one of which just happened to be the very one we were sitting in. I never put my name on the brand. I didn't need to. Real power doesn't announce itself, it waits. After that dinner, I didn't hear from him. Not a call, not a message, not even an attempt at an apology. But I didn't expect one. The silence wasn't just mutual. It was deserved. I had crossed a line that didn't require revenge, closure, or confrontation. It was the kind of line that, once passed, means you no longer need explanations. That night had shifted something permanent. I didn't need to reclaim the past anymore. I had become someone he could no longer define, control, or belittle. And that realization alone was louder than anything he could have said. I had finally become a woman who didn't just survive betrayal, but rose from it untouchable. The most surprising part wasn't the silence that followed. It was the peace. There was no anger left in me, no rage to unpack, just clarity. He had emotionally replaced me long before I walked away. I had been grieving a man who had already left, long before the paperwork was signed, long before the emotional disconnect turned into an affair of attention and energy. What hurt most wasn't even the cheating. It was that he had simply stopped choosing me, day after day, moment after moment, in all the small ways that build a relationship. And now he had to sit with that, with the echo of what he discarded, now standing strong and whole without him. What people don't understand is that you don't move on by proving you're better. You move on by no longer needing to prove anything at all. I no longer needed validation from the same hands that dropped me without care. I wasn't interested in showing him how well I was doing. I was living it. There's a difference. Revenge is wanting them to see what they missed. Healing is realizing you don't care if they ever do. That's what true power feels like. Not dominance, but detachment. That restaurant wasn't just a business investment. It was a personal reclamation. A space I had quietly designed, built, and now owned. Just like the pieces of myself I had carefully pieced back together. After that night, word got around. One of our mutual friends messaged me with, "You really did that." But I didn't reply. Because what I did wasn't for show. It wasn't for social currency. It was for the version of me that once stayed up crying in the bathroom, so he wouldn't hear. For the woman who wrote notes in the margins of business plans he never read. For the girl who once thought being emotionally starved was just the price of a long-term relationship. I owed her more than validation. I owed her a life where she never had to shrink again. I started meeting new people, not in the romantic sense, but in circles I had never allowed myself into before. Investors, artists, women who had built things from scratch. And in every conversation, I carried myself without apology. I was no longer the woman who tiptoed around the room wondering if she belonged. I had learned that belonging isn't given, it's claimed. And sometimes, you only discover your strength when someone walks away from you expecting you to crumble, and you rise instead with nothing but your name and your dignity intact. There were moments, still, where I'd find myself drifting back into the old emotional echoes. I'd pass by places we used to frequent, or hear songs we once danced to in the kitchen, but those memories no longer hurt. They just reminded me how far I had come. They reminded me that while he was out emotionally investing in someone else, I had been unknowingly investing in the strongest version of myself. I used to think love was about sacrifice, but now I know it's about reciprocity. It's about choosing each other every day, not out of obligation, but devotion. And when that stops, what you owe yourself is the courage to walk away with your soul intact. I never reached out to the woman he had emotionally fallen for. I didn't need to. She was never my enemy. In many ways, she was just the mirror that reflected what I had been denying for so long, that I had become emotionally invisible. But now I was standing in rooms that saw me, owning spaces where I once felt small, and building a future that didn't need to be shared with someone who never truly showed up for me. That is the most devastating form of vindication, the kind that doesn't scream, doesn't break things, doesn't beg for closure. It just moves forward, gracefully and completely out of reach.